This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories. China and Japan expressing optimism after the US and Iran struck a framework deal to end months of war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with a formal signing expected Friday. Now, the breakthrough in the Middle East is set to dominate the G7 summit in France as world leaders gather in Evian. US President Donald Trump is due to arrive later today. Now, Myanmar leader Min Aung Hlaing arrives in China for trade talks with President Xi Jinping. It is his second state visit since taking the role of president in April. And Hong Kong launches a public consultation for its first ever 5-year plan that it hopes will help the city seize opportunities and better integrate with the mainland. Also tonight, the disappearance of a celebrity pet in China, reportedly stolen and sold off as food, triggers a nationwide conversation, with a growing community of pet owners challenging the consumption of dog meat. The United States and Iran say they have reached a peace deal to end months of war across the Middle East and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the agreement is due to be signed on Friday in Switzerland, though both sides will reportedly hold separate preparatory talks in Doha ahead of the signing. Well, few details have been made public, but US President Donald Trump says the deal is complete and that ships should soon be able to transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's deputy foreign minister says the agreement brings an immediate end to the war, with further talks expected within 2 months. Pakistan, which announced a breakthrough, says that both sides have now declared a permanent end to military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. The peace agreement was welcomed by global leaders. The UN human rights chief urges for maximum restraint by all sides in the region and to implement the deal quickly and in good faith. Well, China says that it hopes the document will be signed as planned, urging all parties to stay committed to peaceful solutions and to resolve issues through dialogue. Well, Japan expressed hopes that free and safe navigation through Hormuz will be ensured and that a final agreement on Iran's nuclear issue can be reached as soon as possible. For the latest developments, Blake Sifton is reporting for CNA Live from Tel Aviv. Blake, what more do we know about the proposed deal? And also, what are some of the key sticking points that you think need to be resolved before it can be formally signed?
Good evening, Otelli. There are still quite a few details we don't know at this stage. Of course, the precise details of this agreement have not been made public. It's meant to completely end hostilities, end this war. And President Trump has said that the U.S. naval blockade of Iran will come to an end and Iran will reopen the Strait of Hormuz once the deal is signed on Friday. Now, he said that the Strait of Hormuz would be opened and would be toll-free. Now, that's not what Iran is saying. Just in the last half hour, we've heard from Iranian state media. They say that a clause was added to this agreement at the last minute that makes it explicitly clear that Iran will charge what they call maritime service fees to ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has long argued that they have the right to operate and control the Strait of Hormuz, and that was understood to be a major sticking point during these negotiations. Another key issue will be the $24 billion in Iranian assets that the U.S. has frozen. Iran says that half of that money, some $12 billion, will be released before these negotiations toward a final agreement begin. Those negotiations are meant to go on for 60 days, and Iran says that the remaining $12 billion will be released at that point. But U.S. officials have repeatedly said in the past that they will not release any of these frozen funds to Iran before negotiations begin. So we'll have to see what happens there. Another key issue that needs to be resolved during these negotiations is what happens to Iran's supply of highly enriched uranium. Iran has said that they will dilute it in Iran, but U.S. officials have said it must be destroyed and removed from the country.
Well, quite a few sticking points that iron out. But separately, Blake, the deal is supposed to halt all these hostilities across the region, including Lebanon. What could this mean for Israel's campaign against Hezbollah?
Now, the U.S. has not confirmed this yet, but as you say, Pakistan as well as Iran say that this agreement is meant to end the fighting on all fronts, including in Lebanon. So far, that hasn't happened. There's been more Israeli strikes across southern Lebanon this morning, including drone strike and artillery shelling being reported. And a key question is whether the Israeli military, according to this deal, will be required to withdraw from the large swaths of territory in southern Lebanon that they have seized and occupied during this war. Now, Israel was not a party to these negotiations, even though they jointly led this war against Iran with the United States. This agreement is being widely slammed here in Israel. It's being criticized for not meeting any of Israel or the U.S.'s pre-war aims, but especially when it comes to the situation in Lebanon. Now, notably, we have not heard from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yet today about this agreement, but Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz has said that Israel will remain in southern Lebanon indefinitely, and he said, "We oppose an IDF withdrawal from Lebanon despite all of the existing pressures and those that will still come." Prime Minister Netanyahu made these points clear to President Trump. Prime Minister Netanyahu is also under immense pressure from his far-right coalition partners to defy President Trump and remain in Lebanon.
Well, thanks for helping us unpack that U.S.-Iran deal. Blake Sifton there speaking to us for CNA live from Tel Aviv. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump is on his way to France to join another group of 7 leaders for a 3-day summit. And the first day will focus on the long-term reopening of the Strait of Hormuz following the framework peace deal between the U.S. and Iran. Discussions will also include other global challenges such as the war in Ukraine, critical minerals supply, as well as artificial intelligence. Now, Mr. Trump's expected arrival at the summit comes amid strained ties with several bloc members. The American president had slammed the G7 for their lack of support of U.S. operations in Iran. For more on this, we've got Ross Cullen, who is tracking developments on the G7 summit live from Evian, France. Well, thanks, Ross, for joining us this evening. Now, this Middle East conflict has strained relations between the U.S. and all these other G7 members. But with Washington and Tehran now somewhat halting hostilities, how are the G7 members likely to respond to this development?
Well, the G7 members, including the host of France, are pleased with these developments. Telly, the French President Emmanuel Macron is now here in the host city of Evian. His motorcade passed us just in the last 10 minutes or so, and then we'll be expecting the arrival of President Trump later on today. They will be keen to speak to President Trump, and there is a bilateral talk scheduled between the US and French presidents about the Iran deal, about the possibility of reopening the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible. That's what the European members of the G7, so the UK, France, Germany and Italy, and along with the EU, have said this Monday. An immediate opening of toll-free navigation must be brought in for the Strait of Hormuz. France and the UK have said previously they'd be interested in some kind of escort mission or defensive mission to help shipping pass through the critical waterway. But as we were hearing just there from Blake, there's still the possibility that Iran might want to impose tolls. So all the other members of the G7 very keen to speak to the US president to learn more about this expected agreement to be signed later on this week, further down the lake from here in the Swiss city of Geneva. But overall, there is this broad positivity that there could be an end to hostilities, that this agreement is going to be signed on Friday.
But notably absent from the talks in Evian is China. So how is the G7 planning to address all these concerns related to Beijing without Chinese representatives at the table?
Yeah, that's right, Telly. We do have some key Asian representatives. Japan is one of the formal members of the G7, so Prime Minister Takaichi will be here as well. And South Korea has been invited to attend the talks as a guest, but China not. at these G7 talks, although there was Chinese representation during the economic convergence call. It's what France has been describing it, a discussion, a multilateral discussion that was hosted by President Macron last week, a telephone call, a virtual meeting to discuss global economic imbalances, saying it's very important to have China as part of those discussions to try to ease tensions at an economic level. Also, the call was for to be able to initiate cooperation between economies to create the conditions for overall global, balanced and lasting and shared growth. There is a mini conference that Emmanuel Macron will be hosting later this week as part of the G7, looking at global imbalances. But those discussions on Wednesday are also being based upon that call, which took place last week, that call where China was involved. So not formally at the G7, but Emmanuel Macron wanted to make sure there was the Chinese point of view represented in the preview calls that took place ahead of this summit last week. Ateli?
All right, thanks for that. Ross Cullen reporting for CNA from Paris. Now, Myanmar leader Min Aung Hlaing has arrived in Beijing for a 5-day state visit at the invitation of Chinese leader Xi Jinping. This is the retired army chief's second diplomatic trip since taking on the role of president in Myanmar following a visit to India earlier this month. And our senior correspondent Leong Wai-kit unpacks what this trip means for Myanmar and the region.
Like all newly minted heads of state, Myanmar leader Min Aung Hlaing is making overseas trips as part of his diplomatic engagements. But for now, those trips appear to be limited to countries that engage diplomatically with Myanmar. His first trip was to India, a visit that was carefully framed as an official visit rather than a state visit. Now, retired Army Chief Min Aung Hlaing has been invited to China on a state visit, the highest and most formal level of diplomatic engagements between two countries.
This is another way of China saying, getting one up on India. Okay, India invited Min Aung Hlaing. We are also going to invite him, but at a state visit level.
On the surface, Myanmar appears to have some leverage over its neighbours, with both India and China competing for influence in Naypyidaw. After all, both New Delhi and Beijing want stability along their shared borders with Myanmar, while also pursuing their own economic interests.
Myanmar foreign policy may not be much, but they know how to play India against China and China against India. That is something that they have learned quite well in the past decade or so.
Leader Min Aung Hlaing's trip to India provided an opportunity to make some progress on post-coup issues. For instance, he took steps to improve security along their shared border in an effort to fully reopen an India-Myanmar trade route. Both sides also discussed expanding economic cooperation and investment opportunities. But Min Aung Hlaing's trip to China could help him reap even more concrete gains. Myanmar-China expert Dr. Amaratiha said this China trip had been months in the making since late April. He said the timing of the trip could be linked to China waiting for Myanmar to develop a proposal on economic corridor cooperation, including potential oil and gas tie-ups. But domestically, this balancing act faces significant challenges.
Both China and India also will have to be aware of one important thing. Although they have very strong ties with Naypyidaw, the anti-Chinese sentiment and the anti-Indian sentiment in Myanmar is strong. And that is key. That is what will be decisive in the end. You can shake hands and sign deals in Naypyidaw, but on the ground, if you don't have the public support and public acceptance, and let's say the public goodwill, you can't do anything.
And this is what Myanmar is trying to achieve, drumming up support to its advantage, but not necessarily from the public. Many would point out that the military has never received broad support from Myanmar people, from the coup itself to the country's staggered elections that eventually produced the Min Aung Hlaing administration. Instead, Myanmar appears to be making progress in gaining diplomatic support from some ASEAN member states, including Thailand. Experts say Myanmar's early leader-level engagement supports the region's stability objectives, which aligns with ASEAN's security outlook. But for any lasting stability, experts say the key will be for Myanmar to end violence in the country and follow through on the agreed peace framework called the 5-Point Consensus. Leong Waikit, CNA.
Time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, China raising concerns over rapidly changing economic policies in Indonesia, especially for nickel, a commodity they've invested in heavily. Plus, Japan looking at reviving the building of LNG ships domestically. Hello, glad you're with us on East Asia Tonight. You're just in time for some business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, so after the American president who says, let the oil flow, crude prices are apparently falling on news based on that US-Iran peace deal.
Yes, and Asian stocks power to record highs as the US-Iran deal ignites a risk-on rally. And that's hopes that central banks may be able to avoid further interest rate hikes. Now, crude prices falling to a 3-month low following the initial deal between the US and Iran over access through the Strait of Hormuz. Let's take a look at where Brent and the West Texas Intermediate is trading. Both are lower by more than 5%. Brent crude 82.84 a barrel. The US market $80 per barrel. Investors are also watching how quickly the Middle Eastern producers can resume production of oil and LNG following the damage from the war.
So the markets have already reacted. Oil is down sharply in Asia trade today. But is this really a relief story for the energy markets? Well, who are we going to get the answers from other than Roland? So, Roland, we're going to kick things off with the market move. Is this sell-off justified?
Yeah, not quite, because the deal does remove the worst-case scenario, prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So that explains the immediate fall in Brent crude prices, but the physical market will not normalize overnight. I mean, we're still talking about some 500 merchant vessels that are stuck around the straits, according to shipping experts. And normally, traffic through the strait would take about 8 hours, but in today's terms, you are talking about not accounting for mines that needs to be cleared, insurance checks, convoy systems, as well as military coordination for these commercial vessels to pass through the strait. So we're not talking days, we're talking months. So the market reaction is one thing, the actual restoration of oil flow through the Gulf, well, that's another.
Okay, so let's talk about the buyers here who have actually pivoted to other sources. I mean, where do you see them going now? I mean, straight back to Gulf crude?
Well, some may not immediately, but others probably won't. I mean, during the conflict themselves, major Asian buyers had actually pivoted away from Gulf oil. Japan, for instance, it turned to South and Central America as well as Africa. Others lean on their strategic reserves and adjusted their refinery runs. So once this kind of supply chain actually adapts, it doesn't just pivot or it doesn't just reverse overnight. The other thing I should mention is that shipping safety is still an issue. I mean, ship owners still want proof that it is safe to cross the Strait of Hormuz. Secondly, insurance premiums will still be very, very high until there is a track record of ships safely passing through the Strait of Hormuz. And then thirdly, procurement teams had already adapted. They had already started buying crude oil from other places, and they're not likely to want to be caught off guard again should another closure happen.
Right. And Roland, I got to bring China into the picture here. How does Chinese demand actually affect the oil market?
Yeah, China is a big player. Remember, it is the biggest consumer of Gulf oil. So at this point in time, if Chinese refiners see that oil prices are falling and that the shipping routes are secure, they might start buying again and in big numbers in order to replenish their strategic reserves. Secondly, Bloomberg Economics is also showing that Iranian oil imports by China, that had fallen back in February. We're talking about normally 1.8 million barrels a day. That's fallen to some 160,000 barrels a day. So that's quite significant. And what that's done is basically China has been acting as a shock absorber for oil prices. But if the refiners themselves and if China decides it wants to restart buying Iranian oil in big numbers, that could actually also inflate oil prices.
Right, that is very insightful. Thanks so very much for that lowdown, Roland. I believe we've got more news on the horizon, which I'll let you lead that.
Yeah, it's back to more business news. Shares have rallied from Asia to Europe following the peace deal between the US and Iran, which promises to ease inflationary pressure, reducing the need for central bank hikes. Now, in Asia, the gains strongest in Tokyo and Seoul, with the Nikkei at 225 closing up 5%, Kospi Index up 5.2%. Chinese bonds emerging as a surprise haven as the buying pushed yields down. Global ratings agency Fitch affirmed the country's long-term sovereign rating at A, citing its large and diversified economy as well as its important role in global trade. In the currency markets, Japanese yen's weakness persisting ahead of that Bank of Japan policy decision expected tomorrow. It's still hovering around 160 to the greenback. Japan is reportedly looking to breathe new life into its shipbuilding industry in the next decade, with a goal of up to 5 LNG tankers a year. Nikkei reports that 3 Japanese shipbuilders are planning to work together by sharing expertise and skilled labor to produce LNG carriers domestically. And that's after the last one rolled off Japanese shipyards 7 years ago. Japan imports most of its LNG to meet demand, and the fuel is used to generate power and supply gas to households. Japanese shipbuilders used to dominate the market back in the 80s and 90s, but have since ceded ground to shipyards in neighboring countries. South Korea now holds a dominant position in the market, making around 70% of LNG carriers worldwide. Shares of Nomura Shipbuilding and Kawasaki Heavy Industries buoyant in today's trade, while Imabari Shipbuilding, well, that's a private company. Now, gold and silver extending gains after the US and Iran reached an agreement to end the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Gold climbing 2.6% and silver more than 3%. The surge in gold trading over a more than 18-month prompting the London Bullion Market Association to consider moving its morning auction earlier to within an Asian trading time zone. Now, that's with demand in the region growing. Prices out of London have been used as a benchmark by miners, investors, and central banks worldwide. But now the UK capital faces rising competition, with Hong Kong planning to launch a gold clearing system next month. Now, the city aims to become a global hub, mirroring the kind of financial infrastructure used in London. And it's not the only city in Asia with shiny ambition. Now, Singapore is making moves to boost liquidity and to strengthen the gold market infrastructure. The Singapore Exchange will have a clearing system to make it easier for large-scale trades of physical gold stored here. The Singapore Central Bank will also have a gold vault service for foreign central banks and sovereign entities by October. The country is positioning itself as a go-to hub for gold trading. Investors have been flocking to Asia, driving about 70% of annual demand globally.
Asia's demand for financial services is growing, and so is the need for reliable market infrastructure in this time zone. At the same time, global fragmentation and uncertainty are raising the premium on safe, trusted, and credible venues for intermediation. Our initiatives will broaden Singapore's marketplace so that institutions and companies can manage investments for the long term, preserve value, and transact with confidence.
Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong was speaking at an industry event where he announced other measures. Now, these include ongoing plans to develop gold-related capital products. The Monetary Authority of Singapore is also removing the current cap on physical investment of precious metals. That this will allow flexibility for investment funds and family offices to invest. China warns its investments in Indonesia's important nickel industry faces risks from the new Indonesian government policies. The Chinese embassy did so in a letter to the Indonesian Energy Ministry, according to the Financial Times. China estimates that up to $50 billion of investments could be affected. That's $30 billion in existing investments and $20 billion in planned projects, while also reducing annual nickel exports by around $23 billion. In addition, as many as 400,000 jobs across the nickel industry could be impacted. The Chinese embassy pointed to recent regulations which have reduced mining production quotas and introduced a new pricing system. Now, Chinese companies dominate Indonesia's nickel sector, which has grown rapidly in recent years on demand for the use in metals in stainless steel and electric vehicle batteries. Indonesia currently controls more than 2/3 of the world's refined nickel supply. And that is the latest in business. Oteli.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Well, coming up next on East Asia tonight, Hong Kong begins public consultation for its first ever 5-year plan that seeks to better integrate the city's development with the mainland. And as temperatures rise, are cities ready for a hotter future? CNA speaks with a climate scientist at the World Cities Summit in Singapore. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. U.S. President Donald Trump declares a deal to end the war with Iran is now complete, paving the way for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. president now on his way to France to join other leaders from a group of 7 nations for a 3-day summit. And Myanmar's leader, Min Aung Hlaing, arrives in Beijing for a state visit. He is expected to hold trade talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Hong Kong has launched a public consultation for its first ever 5-year plan that it hopes will help the city seize opportunities and better integrate with the mainland. Geraldine Yap finds out what this could mean for the way the city is run.
I'm leading the government to draft the first Hong Kong's 5-year plan, which is
Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee is seeking the views of the people for a planning blueprint that will align the city's development with China's 15th 5-year plan unveiled in March. Not everyone knows what's happening.
咩5年計劃啊？
香港始終都係中國嘅地方嘛，咁雙方面去做一個磨合係一個好嘅策略。
就算係政策上唔似都好，咁你依家你都見到咁多大陸鋪頭進軍咗香港。
Others have bread and butter issues on their minds.
Development 一定需要嘅，同埋政府有多啲嘅 preparation 咧，對於我哋市民都係一件好事咯。
而家好多都會唔同變化啦，咁嚟緊啲青年啊，都迷茫嘅時候啊。
改善下啲本地人就業咯，好似嗰啲外勞 quota 都應該要每一年都定期檢視下咯，隨住個經濟咁樣。
The 5-year plan will cover the economy, industrial development, housing, healthcare, education, and employment, including how AI can be used to create jobs. The government says it wants a plan that belongs to the residents of Hong Kong. It's launched a 2-month consultation, and a big part of that is this website. Residents can submit their views on the economy, livelihoods, social development, and so on. The government says it will also hold in-person sessions with different sectors to gather input. Analysts say this blueprint signals Hong Kong's deeper integration with the Greater Bay Area. It also represents a shift in the city's policy-making process. Until now, the chief executive's yearly policy speech was the city's development roadmap, setting out policies and key performance indicators for the year. When the 5-year plan is in place, analysts say this document will take over and shape future policy addresses.
The socialist style of democratic centralism in policy planning will be adopted, But at the same time, the capitalistic system of Hong Kong is to be retained, so that the one country, two systems is going into a new stage in this kind of development.
The 5-year plan may also mean more consistent policies if and when Hong Kong's leadership changes. A new chief executive will be elected next year, and it is unknown if current chief executive John Lee will seek a second term.
I do believe that it will be a much easier way for either the next leader to basically carry out, to implement these policies, even though I do expect that it is possible to have different fine-tuning during the process. But definitely it is positive from the way that policy may be more consistent than before.
The 5-year plan is expected to be published by the third quarter of this year. Geraldine Yap, CNA, Hong Kong.
As city leaders gather in Singapore for the World City Summit, climate resilience is one of the key issues on the agenda. Now, my colleague Grace Shin was at that event, and she spoke to Winston Chow, the first Singaporean elected to a leadership role at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about whether cities are prepared for a hotter future.
This forthcoming El Nino is a sign, is a sort of a teaser of the long-term climate impacts if we were to exceed the Paris Agreement threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The risks that we face, particularly in this part of the world, are going to be immense. I'll focus in on heat specifically. It's my area of expertise. Not only will you be facing warmer than normal average temperatures, but in cities, because when you replace your natural vegetation with concrete and with asphalt, and you have all your transportation networks that burn oil and gas, you have the local warming effect called the urban heat island effect that makes things worse. So rather than just focusing on the average temperature increases globally, cities, Singapore, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta, so on and so forth, you need to watch out for that additional warmth that can also impact a lot of very vulnerable communities to heat that will be subject to what we'll be seeing over the next couple of months. The extremes of drought conditions, meteorological drought conditions, would also mean wildfire risks, would also mean stressors to how municipal water systems will have to deal with lower flow, but also higher demand from cities. So how do you manage that sort of double whammy of increased warmth and increased drought for cities is something to watch out for.
Something to watch out for, and it is a double whammy for sure. But I think that even our viewers have heard it enough. We need to act now. Leaders should be acting urgently. But why is it that not much action is actually being seen, or why aren't the results changing?
Good question there. The call, like here in the World City Summit, the focus is on acting now. The time for talk is over. We've done, we know what the science has said. So in my work with the IPCC, we have a special report on climate change and cities. We're focusing in on what solutions can work immediately for adapting to the heat and the water risk, but also mitigating in terms of reducing emissions. Cities generate about 70% of emissions worldwide that contribute to climate change, and it will be a great source or a great place to actually start emissions reductions accordingly. But that being said, how do we enable that change is something that's critical. You're talking about how to implement technological advances, how to implement changes in governance policies, how to include local communities into enabling the action, but also the F word, finance. How do you make sure that the solutions that we know can work in the right urban context can be supported through economic incentives, through various private sector funding together with public sector funding? Those are the key discussion points that have to be discussed and enabled so that these solutions can be implemented for the long run.
I understand that financing is important, but do you think more financing needs to be allocated to future planning for preparation or to better help after the disaster?
My view in terms of financing now for prevention is going to be considerably cheaper than whatever you spend on disaster recovery. Prevention is better than cure. I think many city leaders, I think many people from the private sector realize that having that important information early, determining what works in terms of flood protection, what works in terms of heat reduction, while at the same time making sure that these operate efficiently so that they are low emission, that contribute less to greenhouse gas warming. Those sort of solutions done now can help with the overall resilience of cities. You want to make sure you don't face those consequences by being adequately protected and also reducing the causes of climate change, as opposed to going through the bad experience from a severe storm or a tropical cyclone or heat wave, and then learning the lessons after that, which will inevitably be more expensive.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, a look at how a high-profile theft of a celebrity pet dog that was reportedly sold and eaten sparked a legal battle and public outrage over the trade in China. The dog meat trade in China back in the spotlight following the case of a celebrity pet that was reportedly stolen, sold, and eaten. Now, the incident has generated public anger, along with discussion online over animal protection and whether evolving tastes are changing attitudes towards the practice. CNA's Tan Zihui with more.
An end to a 30-hour journey. These dogs traveled from Yulin in southern China to this animal shelter in Beijing, their home for now. The NGO that transported them says they were removed from a slaughterhouse linked to a dog meat trade. 2 of the animals did not survive the trip, but for the 9 that remain, the aim is to eventually find people to adopt them.
现在就是可以看到有好多那个狗的话，它们都是比较怕人的，就是在笼子里边让它们出来的话是很困难的。后续的话，因为我们要打算不是送养嘛，领养，就是我们要改变一些它们的性格，我们会用我们的那个训犬师帮助，就是进行一个社会化训练，让它们从不亲人的状态变成亲人状态。
The dogs will also undergo health checks, tests for infectious diseases and parasites, and treatment for any conditions.
Taishan here is estimated to be about 2 years old, and among all of the dogs rescued, he is in the worst condition. He has mild eye discharge and severe skin condition, and he will take about 3 months of rehabilitation before he can be put up for adoption.
This comes as the case of a celebrity dog named Chuto has renewed debate in China about the dog meat trade. The 8-year-old border collie had more than 1.5 million followers on Chinese social media. It was reportedly stolen while its owner was overseas, sold to a dog meat restaurant in central China for around $25 and later eaten. The owner filed a police report seeking legal redress. But one lawyer we spoke with said there could be challenges. There's currently no national law in China explicitly banning the consumption of dog meat.
因为中国在犬肉的这个销售上没有合法的链条，那么也就是说，又有一些地方它要去吃，那它所有的这个肉用的来源，基本上都是盗窃。
But Mr. An noted that there have been some regulatory changes in recent years. In 2020, dogs were removed from China's livestock catalog and reclassified as pets. In cities such as Shenzhen and Zhuhai, eating dogs and cats is banned. China is also revising a law to step up penalties for pet abandonment and abuse. People we spoke to in Beijing say attitudes have shifted.
狗肉现在好像北京好像以前还吃的多一点，现在好像基本上已经绝迹，北京没什么人吃狗肉了吧？
我养狗，接受不了。
为什么呢？
那肯定是啊，感觉小狗狗们、小宠物们是咱们日常生活中都跟咱们一起生活的。
There are no official national statistics tracking dog meat consumption in China. Past reports estimate that at its peak in 2012, more than 10,000 dogs were slaughtered yearly for a controversial dog meat festival in Yulin in China's Guangxi region. The figure reportedly fell to 2,000 by 2015.
We do hope that, fundamentally the Chinese government can legislate
a special act to make a special act to outlaw dog and cat meat trade. Importantly, China has a huge community of pet, loving people, right? So it is time for the Chinese government to outlaw the trade once and for all.
For the NGO, transporting these dogs from Yulin to a shelter in Beijing is part of a broader effort. Members say they worked with the slaughterhouse owner to close the facility, with him agreeing to leave the dog meat trade. A milestone the group says it hopes can be replicated elsewhere.
Well, for more on the dog meat trade, Tan Si-hui joins us now live from Beijing. So, Si-hui, it does appear that eating dogs and cats is becoming increasingly uncommon in China, but we still see these, dogs being trapped at slaughterhouses and cases like Chuto's as well. So it does suggest that the trade hasn't disappeared entirely.
Yeah, that's right. So even though there are no official statistics on dog meat consumption, we don't see restaurants in first-tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So anecdotally, we can see that the dog meat trade, dog meat consumption is declining, but declining doesn't mean that it is disappearing completely. So in areas of China, there are still pockets of demand in places like northeastern China, southern China, Guangxi region, for example. I was in Guizhou earlier this month. I spoke to some residents. I wanted to understand this practice of eating dog meat. And so take a listen.
我父亲正当打死了，然后弄来吃嘛。因为那时候我们没有像什么羊啊这些的话要拿出来卖钱嘛，然后就那时候生活条件比较艰苦嘛。
所以你本身也是少吃的是吗？
本身都想吃的，但是后面慢慢的逐渐就减少了嘛。
哦，为什么呢？你自己的原因是什么？
自己原因呢，就是狗这个动物还是比较通人性啊，喜欢狗。
孩子呢？
孩子的话就一直就不吃，然后他妈给他灌输这种思想以后，他就不吃了，保护小动物嘛。
And so consuming dog meat, as you just heard, it still exists, but it is slowly declining even in those regions. And one of the reasons is education, awareness. One of the other driver that I spoke with said that since young they were told that animals like dogs are friends. They were also told there were advertisements that said 没有买卖, 没有交易. That means that there is no selling, no buying of dog meat. There will not be the existence of dog meat trade. Now, experts are also saying that it is because of the economy has changed rapidly in China over the years. Living standards have improved, and we've also seen pet ownership increase. Currently, there's pet ownership of about 20% of households in China. And so overall, we do see a decline anecdotally. One restaurant owner I spoke with said that there are still people who eat it in the region where he's at, but because of recent events like the economy, consumer confidence being hit, he's also seeing a decline at his restaurant. 这些人就是反对狗肉嘛，你有什么看法呢？
这个不正常的，有些人他不吃也是很正常的，反正在我们这边基本上人都吃。
你说最近是一般的，你说生意？
啊。
哦，比以前就是降了是吗？降了多少呢？
降了不少哎，有40%左右。
Okay, so there seems to be greater awareness about pet abuse, and there were recent events in Chongqing, right, that even erupted over an alleged abuse case. So can you tell us more about those events, and also what are the Chinese saying?
So two specific events happening over the last few weeks. The first one would be the case of Chuto, which you heard in my story earlier. He was in Henan province. This dog, a celebrity dog, he was allegedly stolen, sold, and eventually eaten. The next event that just happened last week in Chongqing. Apparently, there were reports of a man who had appeared to be an adopter of dogs, but he had allegedly been abusing these dogs. And there were videos going around circulating Weibo showing him abusing the dogs on the balcony. It showed that the dogs had been in severe distress when they were being sent to the vet. We also saw hundreds of protesters standing outside his house. They were calling for authorities to rescue the rest of the animals. And so netizens are saying that these protesters are very brave. And in the case of Chuto, they were actually very surprised that people were still eating dogs in China. And so from these two incidents, you can tell that there is a growing awareness, and they're calling for a greater a step up of regulation, tighter regulation when it comes to animal protection and its laws.
So we are hearing calls for better protection for these animals, but Sophie, why is it taking such a long time for a national law to be put in the first place?
So I spoke with experts and lawyers, and they say that China is a very big country. So that is one big challenge. So although the broader consensus is that people in general are against animal cruelty, but there are still differing opinions across society. So while we may not see a law at the national level, what we can see at first, we will see regulations emerging at the local level. So for example, in Beijing, the lawyer telling me that currently they're revising dog management regulations. There may be penalties added. But what will ultimately move the needle is greater public awareness as well as public understanding.
All right, many thanks for
我更希望生活在一个周围没有人虐待动物的一个环境当中。大家对于这样的一些行为都认为它应当受到法律的制裁，它的比例到达一定程度，我觉得是整个作为立法的一个社会基础，剩下是上层的决策者的问题了。
A lawyer I spoke with also said that this is not just an animal welfare issue. An added complexity is that public welfare, also criminal activity, is part of this whole debate, because as we know from the Chuto case, he also said that dogs are being allegedly snatched off the streets and being placed in the dog meat trade. But with that said, gradual progress is happening, and hopefully with these two high-profile cases, we can see change happening at the legislation level.
Well, thanks so very much for that report, CNA correspondent Han Sihui speaking to us live from Beijing. And that is all the time we have for you on Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. And you can find us on all the socials, including Facebook and YouTube. Also, for our Singapore audience, do stay on for highlights from the FIFA World Cup matches.
Japan battled back twice to hold the Netherlands to a draw in their opening Group F match in Dallas. Following a goalless first half, captain Virgil van Dijk powered the Dutch ahead in the 50th minute. Keito Nakamura got the equalizer 7 minutes later to make it 1-1. The Dutch retook the lead in the 64th minute with this screamer. But Samurai Blue kept fighting and were rewarded in the 89th minute. Daichi Kamada deflecting in Koki Ogawa's header to make it 2-2 at the death. But Sweden moved top of Group E after trouncing Tunisia in Monterrey Stadium. Yasin Ayari getting the ball rolling for the Swedes after just 7 minutes. Liverpool's Alexander Isak made it 2-0 at the half-hour mark before Tunisia pulled one back in the 43rd minute. But the Swedes ran riot in the second half. Arsenal's Victor Gyökeres scoring from pressure on the Tunisian defence in the 59th minute. Matthias Swanberg slotted home seconds after, coming on in the 84th minute with a goal ruled onside by VAR before Ayari slammed in his second right at the end to complete the 5-1 rout. Earlier, Germany overwhelmed debutants Curaçao in the opening Group E match, going ahead after just 6 minutes in Houston. But the competition's smallest nation rocked the German Giants in the 21st minute. Livano Kamenencia scoring Curaçao's first ever World Cup goal. And that kick-started the German goal machine with 2 goals before the half, including a Kai Havertz spot kick and 4 more after the break. Havertz rounding out the 7-1 rout with his second of the game in the 88th minute. In the later Group E match, the Ivory Coast left it late against Ecuador to steal victory. Manchester United's Ahmad Diallo coming off the bench for the 90th minute winner.